Republicans deciding they are going to defy Trump. They're not going to redistrict their state because Trump told them to. They're not going to be bullied, and they're willing to say so in great numbers. When you see something like that, consider, yes, the bravery of those Indiana Republicans in deciding not to be pushed around. But consider also the political weather that Donald Trump has created by doing very unpopular things and by doing his job very poorly. He has therefore and thereby made himself and his party very unpopular. And that changes the course of other decisions by other politicians all around the country, right? The Indiana protesters who showed up again and again and again and filled their state capitol in Indiana and told their Republican state legislators to not cave to Trump, to not do it, to stand on principle. Those protesters who showed up over and over and over again in Indiana, they very well may have put steel in the spines of those Republicans to get them to stand up and say no to Trump.
If you think redistricting is just boring lines on a map of Indiana, just prove those lines can shake the entire country. And tonight I'm asking you straight up, should any president, any party be able to pressure a state to redraw your vote like it's a chessboard? Picture the Indiana State House in Indianapolis, the kind of place where politics usually moves with Midwestern patience. But this time the atmosphere was anything but calm because the question on the table wasn't small. It wasn't routine, it was we'll deal with it later. It was the kind of decision that changes who gets a voice in Washington for years, and it came with national pressure, inside party tension, and reports of threats that left lawmakers looking over their shoulders. Here's what happened in plain English before we go deeper. Indiana's Republican-led Senate voted down a Trump-backed plan to redraw the state's congressional map ahead of the 2026 midterms. The proposal was designed to give Republicans an advantage, potentially even turning Indiana into a 9-0 Republican congressional delegation by reshaping districts that currently elect Democrats. But in a rare break with the White House, a majority of Indiana Republican senators joined Democrats to block it. The final vote, 31-19 against the plan. Now pause right there because that number is the whole story. 31 senators said no, 19 said yes. And the no side wasn't just Democrats. It included a big block of Republicans who decided in that moment that the pressure campaign, the timing, the optics, or the principle, maybe all of it was too much. So let me ask you, when politicians refuse their own party's president, what do you think is really going on? Is it conscience? Is it fear of backlash? Is it local voters saying, don't you dare? Or is it something else, something strategic? Because the way this played out matters, not just for Indiana, but for how redistricting battles could spread across the country in the run-up to 2026. To understand why this fight exploded, you have to understand what redistricting is and why mid-decade redistricting sets off alarms. Normally, congressional maps get redrawn after the U.S. Census, once every 10 years. States adjust districts to reflect population changes. That process is messy, political, and often controversial, but it's expected. It's the scheduled storm. Mid-decade redistricting is different. It's not about a new census. It's not the decade turned, so we redraw. It's a choice to reopen the map in the middle of the decade, often because political incentives changed, because leaders believe a new map could produce better election outcomes for their side. Supporters of mid-decade redistricting argue, it's legal in many places and politics is politics. If the other side draws aggressive maps, why should we fight with one hand tied behind our back? If voters reward the party in power, why shouldn't that party lock in its agenda and protect its majority? Opponents argue, this turns democracy into a constant arms race. It tells voters the lines will keep shifting until the people in power get the outcomes they want. And it creates confusion for election officials and voters. New districts, new precinct splits, new ballots, new candidate strategies, right as an election cycle is heating up. So when Indiana lawmakers were asked to do it mid-decade, this wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. It was emotional, and it was intensely national. Because this push was tied to President Donald Trump and his allies urging Republican-led states to redraw maps to strengthen the party's position heading into the 2026 midterms, Indiana became one of the big tests. Would the state comply with a national strategy or would it resist? And in Indiana, the answer was no. But let's get specific about what was on the table, because redistricting is abstract until you see what it does to real places where real people live. Reports describe a plan that would restructure all 9 of Indiana's congressional districts to heavily favor Republicans. One key tactic, dividing Democratic-leaning Indianapolis, breaking apart a concentrated voting bloc and spreading it into multiple districts where it could be outvoted. Another focus, the Northwest District held by Democrat Frank Marvan and the Indianapolis-based Democratic seat held by Rep. Andre Carson, 2 of the state's most reliable Democratic strongholds. If you live outside politics, that might sound like insider talk, but it's actually very simple. If you take a group of voters who tend to vote for one party and you slice them into multiple districts, you can reduce their power. It's like taking a loud choir and separating them into different rooms. Suddenly, none of the rooms sounds as powerful. And that's why people call it gerrymandering, shaping districts to produce a political outcome. Now, supporters of the proposal didn't hide their logic. The argument was basically, Democrats have used map drawing to their advantage in other states and Republicans need to respond nationally. If you believe politics is war by another name, then maps are weapons. And the House majority in Washington can be decided by just a handful of seats. So supporters saw Indiana as an opportunity, an extra seat or two here, an extra seat or two there, and suddenly your party's path to controlling Congress looks very different. But the opposition inside Indiana was not just about fairness. It was also about timing, cost, and what one election official warned could become chaos on the ground. In public reporting, Marion County's election administration warned lawmakers that late map changes could strain budgets, manpower, and systems. Because implementing new districts takes time, money, and precision. Splitting counties, townships, and precincts means rebuilding voter rolls, reassigning voters, reconfiguring polling places, retraining poll workers, and rewriting the entire election playbook under deadline pressure. And this is where I want you to think like a regular voter for a second. Have you ever walked into a polling place and felt even slightly unsure? Is this my district? Is this my ballot? Am I at the right location? Now imagine that uncertainty multiplied across an entire county. Because boundaries changed close to a primary, because voters were shifted into new districts, because precinct lines got redrawn like a puzzle dumped onto the table. Do you believe that makes people more confident in elections or less? And do you think lawmakers should be able to trigger that kind of disruption in the middle of the decade? Now let's talk about why this vote became so intense, because it wasn't just the map. It was the pressure. Multiple outlets reported a sustained push from Trump and allies, including Vice President J.D. Vance and other prominent figures and outside groups, to get Indiana Republicans in line. That's not unusual in American politics. Party leaders lobby, they call, they twist arms, they make promises. But what stood out here were reports that lawmakers faced threats and even swatting attempts, hoax emergency calls meant to send police rushing to someone's home. And there were also claims floating around about potential consequences for Indiana if the plan failed, warnings of retaliation, even talk tied to federal funding in the political pressure campaign. When politics reaches the point where lawmakers are hearing threats at home or families are being targeted, it changes the meaning of a vote. It turns it into a test of personal courage or personal survival, depending on how you see it. So here's a question I want you to answer in the comments honestly. If you were a state senator and you believed your family might be dragged into national political warfare, would you still vote your conscience? Or would you choose the path of least danger? And if you say, I'd vote my conscience, I respect that, but I also want you to admit something. It's easy to say from a couch. It's harder when your phone is buzzing and your spouse is scared and your grandkids are getting messages. And that brings us to the most dramatic part of this story, the no votes from within the Republican caucus. Because it wasn't a narrow Democratic victory. It was a Republican-led Senate rejecting a Republican president's push. That's political friction you don't see every day. Why would they do it? Some lawmakers emphasized a familiar principle: local representation matters. Indiana voters elect state senators to represent Indiana communities, not national strategy. If the map is perceived as being dictated from Washington or from outside the state, there's a pride factor that kicks in. There's also the moral factor. Some lawmakers don't want to be associated with an aggressive gerrymander, especially one seen as eliminating the state's Democratic districts by design. They may ask themselves, will this look like Indiana is trying to rig outcomes? Will it erode trust? Will it make the system feel illegitimate to half the electorate? Then there's the strategic factor. Even if a gerrymander benefits your party short-term, it can backfire long-term. It can energize the opposition. It can trigger lawsuits. It can become a national scandal. It can create unstable districts that swing wildly in wave elections, and it can put you, the state senator, at the center of a national firestorm you never wanted. So when the Indiana Senate rejected the Plan 3119, it wasn't just a legislative defeat. It was a message. To the White House, it signaled limits. To national groups, it signaled resistance. To other states watching, it signaled something even bigger. This mid-decade redistricting push is not guaranteed to succeed everywhere. And if you're a political strategist, you know what comes next. The story doesn't end with one vote. It moves into the aftermath: who gets blamed, who gets threatened with primaries, who gets pressured next time, and whether this fight reappears in another form. Because the moment Indiana said no, the next question became, what does no cost? Will there be retaliation inside party politics? Will lawmakers who voted no face primary challengers? Will they be targeted by national fundraising machines? Will conservative groups label them as disloyal, or will Indiana voters reward them for independence? And here's the twist that many people miss. Lawmakers can be punished for either choice. Vote yes, and you can be accused of gerrymandering, of undermining democracy, of manipulating voters. Vote no, and you can be accused of betraying your party, of weakening the national strategy, of handing an advantage to the other side. That's why this story is so revealing. It shows how American politics traps officials between national pressure and local legitimacy. Now I want to widen the lens because Indiana isn't happening in a vacuum. Across the country, redistricting fights are becoming more frequent, more aggressive, and more explicitly tied to control of Congress. Some states have moved to implement new maps, and national leaders know that just a few seats can decide everything: committee chairs, investigations, budgets, impeachment politics, and the entire direction of federal policy. So from a strategic view, the logic is obvious. If you can shape the map, you can shape the majority. But from a citizen view, this feels like the rules are being rewritten mid-game. And that's the question I want you to sit with. Do you want elections to be about persuading voters? Or about rearranging voters? Because that's what redistricting can become in its darkest form. Not "here's our platform, vote for us," but "here are the lines, now try to beat us." Now, supporters of the Trump-backed push would respond. Both parties do it. They would argue the system is already broken. They would say Democrats gerrymander when they can, Republicans gerrymander when they can, and the only difference is who has the power in which state. They might also argue that Indiana's current map and national map dynamics are already shaped by political calculation, and that refusing to redraw now is like refusing to play defense while the other team runs up the score. Opponents would respond, that's exactly why reform is needed. They would argue that everyone does it is not a moral defense. They would argue that the answer to a rigged system is not more rigging, it's rules that prevent it, like independent commissions or stricter criteria for district boundaries. And if you're watching right now, you might be thinking, okay, but what's the solution? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Solutions require politicians to voluntarily give up power. That's rare, but not impossible. Some states use independent or bipartisan commissions. Some states have court interventions. Some states have stronger legal rules around compactness, respecting county lines, or preventing partisan favoritism. Indiana, in this moment, didn't adopt a new reform structure. It simply rejected a specific plan under intense national pressure to redraw the map in a way that critics described as deeply partisan. So in the short term, the map stays. The two Democratic-held districts remain in play. And the question becomes, is Indiana now the template for resistance? Or an exception that proves the rule, because you can already feel how both sides will spin it. Trump allies may say, Indiana Republicans missed an opportunity. They may argue this was a chance to secure the House. They may frame the no votes as weakness, disloyalty, or fear of media backlash. Opponents of the plan may say this was principled. They may frame it as courage, independence, and respect for voters. They may say Indiana refused to let national power rewrite local representation. And in the middle is the average voter trying to decide what's real. So here's my challenge to you, because I don't want you to just pick a team and move on. I want you to think. If Democrats did the exact same thing in a blue state, mid-decade, aggressive map, national pressure, would you support it? If your answer changes based on which party is benefiting, then you're not defending democracy. You're defending advantage, and that's not an insult. It's human, but we should admit it. Now let's talk about what this means going into 2026, because the midterms are always about more than midterms. They are a referendum on power. A president's party often struggles in midterms. That's political gravity. So any strategy to strengthen the party's position, whether through messaging, policy wins, or map drawing, becomes more attractive. But Indiana just showed that even within a president's party, there are limits to what lawmakers are willing to do, especially when the move looks too aggressive, too rushed, too externally dictated, or too risky. And this is where I want to ask you another question. Do you believe the Republican Party is becoming more unified or more fractured? Because stories like this are often less about the map and more about the coalition. They show who still has influence, who resists, and how power is negotiated inside a party. This vote also raises another issue that barely gets talked about. The legitimacy of elections depends on rules that people can recognize as fair even when their side loses. When rules feel rigged, losing feels illegitimate. When losing feels illegitimate, trust collapses. And when trust collapses, everything else becomes harder: governance, compromise, even basic stability. So when Indiana lawmakers said no, part of what they were really deciding, whether they admitted it or not, was how much they want to contribute to that trust crisis. And I want to be clear, you can believe your party is right on policy and still believe rigging the map is wrong. Those two beliefs can coexist. Now, if you're still with me, here's where this story gets even more interesting. Because even though the plan failed, the pressure machine doesn't just shut off, it redirects. If you're watching the national redistricting chessboard, you'll be looking at other states, where leadership might be more compliant, where legislatures might be more disciplined, where internal dissent might be smaller. And you'll be looking at counter moves. If one side redraws aggressively, the other side looks for its own opportunities through courts, through commissions, through legislative action in states it controls. That is how map wars escalate. And if you think map wars are just political insiders arguing, remember this. Your district line determines who represents you, who shows up in your community, whose office answers your call, which issues get attention, and which voices get ignored. So yes, it matters. Now I want you to do something for me. Before you scroll away, comment with one word, just one word, so I know you're still here. Fair, if you believe maps should aim for fairness even if your party loses seats. Fight if you believe politics is a battlefield and your side should use every legal tool to win. Or reform if you think the whole system needs a redesign so neither party can play these games. Because the comments on stories like this are the real heartbeat of public opinion. And if you want the most important takeaway tonight, it's this. Indiana didn't just vote down a bill. Indiana tested the boundary between national power and local representation, and for now, local representation held the line. But the story isn't over, because the moment one state resists, the pressure shifts somewhere else. And the moment pressure shifts somewhere else, the whole country watches to see who says yes and who says no. So the next time you hear the word redistricting, don't think of it as paperwork. Think of it as power. Think of it as the quiet architecture of your democracy. And ask yourself, who should control that architecture, voters or politicians?